Murder at the Village Tea Room. Dear listeners, welcome back to Tea Time Mysteries. I'm your host Henry, and I'm glad you're here. Wherever you're listening from across Asia, these cosy Miss Marple mysteries bring us together. Tonight's story was chosen by our community. Thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Now pour your tea, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Tea Room on Bell Lane. The village of Little Doveton prided itself on being the sort of place where nothing truly unpleasant ever happened. At least, not in daylight, and certainly not over a cup of tea. It lay folded into the gentle Wiltshire countryside, its stone cottages crouched comfortably beside hedgerows that had not changed their minds for centuries. The church bell rang with punctual restraint. The post arrived at 10 minutes past 9, and the greatest topic of discussion was usually whose roses had failed to bloom that season. On this particular Thursday afternoon, the centre of village life was Primrose Tea Rooms, a modest establishment on Bell Lane run by Miss Hazel Trent. It was known for its seed cake, its slightly mismatched china, and its air of respectable coziness that encouraged confidences. By 3:30, nearly every table was occupied. Miss Marple sat at her usual place by the window, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, while a cup of weak tea cooled beside her. She observed the street beyond with mild interest, though anyone glancing at her would have assumed her thoughts were elsewhere. Perhaps on the knitting tucked away in her handbag or on the weather, which was threatening rain in a half-hearted fashion. Inside the tea room, voices hummed gently. At the centre table sat Colonel Arthur Bellingham, retired, red-faced and upright, holding forth on the lamentable decline of standards everywhere. Across from him, Mrs. Winifred Cole, the vicar's wife, nodded with practised sympathy while mentally noting everything he said for later repetition. Near the counter, Emily Foster, the young schoolteacher newly arrived from Bath, stirred her tea with a distracted air, listening more than she spoke. Behind the counter, Miss Hazel Trent moved briskly, arranging scones with an efficiency that bordered on severity. She was a woman of about 50, with sharp eyes and a mouth that rarely relaxed into a smile unless customers were watching. It was Mrs. Cole who noticed the absence first. "How very odd," she murmured, craning her neck slightly. "Has anyone seen Mr. Leonard Price today?" The name caused a momentary shift in the room's atmosphere, as though someone had opened a window. Leonard Price was not universally beloved in Little Doveton. He was a property developer by trade, a man who spoke often of potential and progress in a village that preferred things exactly as they were. "He was meant to be here," said Miss Trent sharply. "He rang this morning and said he'd take his usual pot of Darjeeling at 4. Colonel Bellingham snorted. "Probably off charming some council committee. Mark my words, that man will ruin Bell Lane yet." Miss Marple lifted her eyes briefly. Leonard Price, she recalled, had the habit of smiling without warmth, a trait she'd seen before in others who considered people rather as stepping stones. She said nothing, merely added a small amount of milk to her tea. The bell over the tea room door jingled then, admitting Inspector Harold Finch, accompanied by Constable Davies. Their appearance caused a noticeable hush. "Well now," said Miss Trent, stiffening, "this is unexpected." Inspector Finch removed his hat, his expression carefully neutral. "Afternoon, ladies. Colonel, I'm afraid I have some unpleasant news." A murmur rippled through the room. "Mr. Leonard Price has been found in the back room," Finch continued. "He's dead." For a moment no one spoke. Then Mrs. Cole gasped softly and pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "Dead?" Colonel Bellingham echoed. "Here?" "In the storage room behind the kitchen," said Finch. "We believe he arrived earlier than expected." Miss Trent sank into a chair, her face pale. "That room's hardly ever used. He must have gone back there himself." "Cause of death?" asked Emily Foster quietly. Inspector Finch hesitated. "Blunt force trauma to the head." There was a heavy brass teapot nearby. A collective shiver passed through the room. Miss Marple, who had been gazing into her teacup, looked up at that. Her eyes were thoughtful, not shocked. She had once known a woman in St. Mary Mead who had used a fireplace poker with remarkably similar results, all because of a long-standing grievance that no one had taken seriously. "Was anyone else here at the time?" asked Mrs. Cole. Finch's gaze swept the room. "That's what we'll be finding out." Constable Davies began taking names, while Finch spoke quietly with Miss Trent near the counter. The tea room, so recently a haven of small pleasures, now felt oddly exposed. Cups sat untouched. Cake went uneaten. I always said he'd come to a bad end, Colonel Bellingham muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple listened, her head slightly tilted. It struck her as curious that no one expressed genuine sorrow. Shock, yes. Alarm, certainly. But grief? No. That, she reflected, was often the first sign that a person had left more enemies than friends. Inspector Finch eventually approached her table. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said politely. "You were present this afternoon?" "Yes, indeed," she replied, smiling faintly. "I come here every Thursday." "Did you see Mr. Bazaroux? Price arrive?" "No," said Miss Marple. "But then, I was watching the sparrows on the wall outside. They've been quarrelling most dreadfully." Finch nodded, unsure what to make of that. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple considered. "Only that Miss Trent seemed rather flustered earlier than usual. I thought perhaps she'd burned the scones." Miss Trent, overhearing, flushed. "I was perfectly calm." "Of course," said Miss Marple gently. "One often is." Inspector Finch made a note, thanked her, and moved on. As the police cordoned off the back room and ushered the remaining patrons outside, rain finally began to fall, soft but persistent. Villagers gathered in small knots along Bell Lane, voices lowered, theories already forming. Miss Marple stood beneath her umbrella, surveying the familiar street now tinged with unease. She had seen this before, how a single violent act could peel back the surface of respectability to reveal something far less orderly beneath. "Well," she murmured to herself, "this will cause a great deal of talk." And as she walked slowly home, her mind was already at work, quietly arranging impressions, remembering glances and tones and tiny inconsistencies, those small human details that, in her experience, so often mattered most. Little Doveton, she suspected, had been keeping secrets for years, and one of them had just turned deadly. Chapter 2. The Village Finds Its Voice. By the following morning, Little Doveton had quite forgotten its usual restraint. The news of Leonard Price's death had travelled with remarkable efficiency, carried not by official announcement but by whispers, glances, and hurried conversations over garden fences. By breakfast time, every villager knew not only that a murder had occurred at Primrose Tea Rooms, but also possessed a firm opinion on who must be responsible and why. Miss Marple, setting out after an early cup of tea, encountered Mrs. Hilda Green almost at once. Mrs. Green was trimming her hedge with unnecessary vigour, a sure sign that she was brimming with information. "Well, Miss Marple," she said without preamble, "I expect you heard. Shocking business. Though if you ask me, it was only a matter of time." "So I've been thinking," Miss Marple replied mildly. "One does sometimes sow the wind." Mrs. Green leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Everyone's saying it must have been Miss Hazel Trent. That man was always pressuring her about selling the tea room, you know." "Wanted to turn it into flats." "Did he?" Miss Marple murmured. "Oh yes, quite openly too. I saw him there last week arguing with her in broad daylight. She was white as a sheet afterward." Miss Marple thanked her and continued on, reflecting that public arguments were often convenient distractions. Those who killed in passion rarely announced their motives so plainly. At the corner by the post office she encountered Colonel Bellingham, who stopped her with a stiff nod. "Terrible affair," he said, "though I've told Finch exactly what I think." "And what is that?" Miss Marple asked. "Foster girl," he said at once. "That school teacher. Price was pushing for that new housing estate. Would have brought all sorts into the village. She's a modern type, full of notions. Probably had a row with him." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Young women do sometimes have strong opinions." "Precisely," the Colonel said, satisfied. She went on her way, her thoughts turning quietly. 2 suspects already, and neither suggestion based on anything more than prejudice and convenience. It was a pattern she knew well. Primrose Tea Rooms remained closed, its windows dark. A small cluster of flowers lay outside the door, placed there by Mrs. Cole, who believed firmly in visible gestures of propriety. Inspector Finch and Constable Davies were inside, questioning staff and examining the premises. Miss Marple paused across the street, studying the building. The storage room was at the back, accessible through the kitchen. It was an odd place for Leonard Price to have gone voluntarily, unless he had been invited. At that moment Emily Foster appeared, walking briskly with a stack of exercise books under her arm. She looked tired, her expression strained. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said politely, slowing her pace. "A sad business," Miss Marple observed. "You must find it unsettling being new to the village." "Yes," Emily admitted. "Everyone keeps looking at me as though I've done something dreadful." "People do like their stories," Miss Marple said gently. "They find uncertainty so uncomfortable." Emily hesitated. "I barely knew Mr. Price. He came to the school once, talking about investment opportunities. I found him unpleasant." "Many people did," said Miss Marple. "That does not make you a murderer." Emily laughed faintly and moved on, looking relieved. Later that afternoon the village gathered again, this time at the vicarage, where Mrs. Cole had insisted on providing tea for those distressed by recent events. It was, in truth, an excellent opportunity for collective speculation. Inspector Finch was present, answering questions with cautious neutrality. "We're keeping an open mind," he said for perhaps the 10th time. "Everyone who was in or near the tea room yesterday afternoon will be spoken to." "And Miss Trent?" Mrs. Green asked pointedly. "Miss Trent is assisting us with our inquiries." Miss Marple watched Hazel Trent from across the room. The woman sat stiffly on the edge of a chair, her hands clenched together. She looked more angry than frightened, a detail Miss Marple found interesting. "Did Leonard Price have any enemies?" Mrs. Cole asked. Finch allowed himself a thin smile. "Quite a few, it seems." The talk grew animated, theories multiplying like rabbits. Someone suggested robbery. Another hinted darkly at blackmail. Colonel Bellingham repeated his views at length. Miss Marple listened, absorbing not just the words but the tones, the pauses, the eagerness with which some spoke and the reluctance of others. At one point Hazel Trent stood abruptly. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice sharp, "and I'm tired of everyone thinking I did." There was an awkward silence. "I told the inspector everything," she went on. "Yes, he wanted to buy the tea room. Yes, I refused. But I wasn't even in the building when he arrived yesterday. I'd stepped out to fetch milk." Inspector Finch nodded. "We can confirm that Miss Trent was seen at the grocer's shortly before 4. Mrs. Green looked disappointed. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Hazel Trent. Fetching milk was such an ordinary errand, almost too ordinary. She wondered how long Miss Trent had been gone, and who else might have known of her absence. As the gathering broke up, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Inspector Finch. "You have a remarkable village," he said dryly. "Everyone's an amateur detective." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and so very certain." "Do you have a theory yourself?" Finch asked, half in jest. Miss Marple smiled. "Not a theory, just an observation. People often think violence comes from sudden anger, but in my experience it more often grows from patience." Finch raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. That evening, as dusk settled over Little Doveton, Miss Marple sat by her window knitting forgotten in her lap. She replayed the day's conversations in her mind, the eagerness to accuse, the relief when suspicion shifted elsewhere, the subtle tightening of voices when certain names were mentioned. Leonard Price had been a man who pressed, prodded, and persisted. Such men, she knew, rarely realized how carefully resentment could be cultivated around them. Somewhere in the village, the person who had struck the fatal blow was listening too, gauging the mood, adjusting their mask. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "It's very like the case of Mrs. Pritchard's lodger," she murmured. Everyone looked at the shouting. No one noticed the silence. And it was that silence, the things not said, the moments not accounted for, that she intended to examine next. Chapter 3. Quiet Questions and Unremarkable Answers. Inspector Finch conducted his interviews with commendable thoroughness, though Miss Marple suspected that even his patience was being tested by the sheer enthusiasm with which Little Doveton supplied opinions in place of facts. By the 3rd day, after Leonard Price's death, the novelty of the crime had not worn off. If anything, it had ripened. Miss Marple, for her part, made no overt effort to involve herself. She went about her routines as usual, morning walks, polite calls, church on Sunday, listening far more than she spoke. It was remarkable how readily people confided in someone they considered harmless. Her first visit was to the grocer's shop, ostensibly to purchase marmalade. "Yes, Miss Trent was here that afternoon," Mr. Wilkes confirmed, leaning on the counter. "Just before 4, I'd say. Bought milk and eggs. She seemed in a hurry." "In a hurry?" Miss Marple echoed. "Well, not flustered exactly." "Purposeful. Like someone who didn't want to be late." "Late for what?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mr. Wilkes shrugged. She didn't say purposeful. Miss Marple turned the word over in her mind. There were many kinds of haste. Fear was only one of them. From the shop she walked to the schoolhouse, where Emily Foster was overseeing children in the yard. The young woman greeted her with a weary smile. "It's all rather dreadful," Emily said once the children had gone inside. "I can't go anywhere without feeling watched." "Familiarity breeds suspicion," Miss Marple observed. "When people are frightened, they like neat answers." Emily hesitated. "Inspector Finch asked me about Mr. Price's visit to the school. I told him the truth. He spoke to me about the new estate, said it would bring vitality." "And what did you think?" Miss Marple asked. "I thought he meant profit," Emily said simply. "He asked if I planned to stay in the village long term. It felt intrusive." Miss Marple nodded. He was a man who liked to take inventory. Emily looked puzzled but thoughtful. That afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Colonel Bellingham again, this time in the churchyard. "I've been thinking," the Colonel said, lowering his voice, "about that brass teapot. Heavy thing. You'd need a certain strength." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "though adrenaline can be most helpful." The Colonel frowned. "You're not suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing," Miss Marple replied placidly. What interested her far more was not who could have wielded the teapot, but who would have known it was there. Primrose Tea Rooms prided itself on appearance. The brass teapot was kept polished but rarely used, brought out only for special occasions. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Cole, who was only too eager to talk. "I do feel so sorry for Hazel," Mrs. Cole said, pouring tea. "Though she can be sharp-tongued. Leonard Price did frighten her, you know." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh yes. He hinted he knew things. About the tea room, about her finances. She confided in me once that she feared he might force her hand." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Did she say how he might do that?" Mrs. Cole hesitated. "No, only that he'd been asking questions about the building's history." That was interesting. Buildings, like people, often had inconvenient pasts. As Miss Marple left the vicarage, she nearly collided with Inspector Finch himself. "Miss Marple," he said, smiling faintly, "I hear you've been making the rounds." "Purely social," she replied. "I'm sure. Still, if you happen to notice anything—" "I always do," said Miss Marple pleasantly. That evening she sat once more by her window, watching the lights flicker on across the village. She thought of a Leonard Price arriving early at the tea room, of Hazel Trent stepping out at precisely the wrong or right moment, of the storage room that no one used. And then there was the matter of timing. Inspector Finch had mentioned, almost in passing, that the medical examiner estimated the time of death at some time between 3:30 and 4. A narrow window, too narrow for coincidence. Miss Marple recalled something else. When Inspector Finch had first entered the tea room, Miss Trent had said Leonard Price rang that morning to say he would arrive at 4. "People who plan," Miss Marple murmured, "rarely announce themselves accurately." She reached for her knitting again, though her hands remained still. Somewhere in Little Doveton, someone was very carefully replaying events just as she was, checking for loose ends, gauging which stories had been believed. There was one story, however, that had been told only once and then not repeated. Hazel Trent's errand for milk. Miss Marple suspected that the truth of this case lay not in dramatic confrontations or violent tempers, but in something far more mundane, a habit, perhaps, or an expectation quietly relied upon. And habits, she knew, were among the most revealing things about human nature. Tomorrow, she decided, she would return to Primrose Tea Rooms, closed though it was, and see what could be learned from what people assumed no longer mattered. Chapter 4. The Unused Room. Primrose Tea Rooms looked smaller, with its windows shuttered and its door bearing the discreet notice "closed until further notice." Without the gentle clatter of china and the comforting smell of baking, the building seemed stripped of its pretensions, reduced to brick, mortar, and memory. Miss Marple approached it just after 10 o'clock the following morning. She had timed her visit carefully. Inspector Finch had mentioned, quite casually, that the police would not return until the afternoon. There was nothing improper, she reasoned, in looking at a place that was, after all, part of her village. The side door was locked, but the front door yielded after a moment's hesitation. Hazel Trent had always been meticulous about security during business hours. It seemed she was less so now. Inside, the tea room was neat, almost aggressively tidy. Chairs were stacked on tables, the counter wiped to a sterile shine. Only the faint smell of polish lingered, mingled with something older. Tea leaves, perhaps, embedded into the very walls. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust and her thoughts settle. She had learned long ago that rooms, like people, gave up their secrets only when one did not rush them. She walked first to the counter, noting how everything was arranged for efficiency rather than comfort. Hazel Trent, she reflected, was not a woman given to indulgence. That in itself told one a great deal. Beyond the counter lay the kitchen, and beyond that, the narrow corridor leading to the storage room. Miss Marple paused there. The storage room door stood ajar, its edges scarred from years of careless handling. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by a small window high on the wall. Shelves lined one side holding spare crockery, tins, cleaning supplies. It was, in short, exactly what one would expect, except for the fact that Leonard Price had died there. Miss Marple stepped inside. The police had removed the body and the teapot, but traces of disturbance remained. One shelf was slightly askew. A chair had been pushed back abruptly, its legs leaving faint marks on the floor. Miss Marple crouched, carefully, stiffly, and examined those marks. Dragged, she murmured, not toppled. She straightened, her gaze drifting to the window. It was too high to see out of properly. But one could hear the sounds of the street, a cart passing, a voice raised in greeting. It occurred to her that this room, despite its obscurity, was not as isolated as people assumed. "You don't have to shout to be heard," she said softly, "only to be listened to." She returned to the main room and stood by the window where she usually sat. From here, one could see Bell Lane clearly. Anyone arriving would be visible, anyone leaving too. A thought settled quietly into place. The bell over the door jingled, and Miss Marple turned to see Hazel Trent herself standing there, her face hardening at once. "I might have guessed," Hazel said. "Everyone else is poking about too. Why not you?" "I hope you'll forgive me," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I was curious." Hazel gave a short laugh. "Curious. That's what they all say." She moved behind the counter, folding her arms. Up close, Miss Marple could see the strain around her eyes. "It must be very difficult," Miss Marple said gently, "to have one's livelihood and one's reputation questioned at the same time." Hazel's jaw tightened. "Leonard Price was trying to bully me. That's all there is to it." "Bullies," said Miss Marple, "often rely on knowing exactly when someone will not be present." Hazel stared at her. "What do you mean by that?" "Only that routines are very useful things," Miss Marple replied. "Yours, for instance. Fetching milk every Thursday." Hazel's expression flickered, just briefly, but it was enough. "I've always done it," she said sharply. "Suppliers don't deliver fresh milk on Thursdays." "Of course," said Miss Marple, "and everyone knows that." There was a pause. "Miss Trent," Miss Marple went on, "did Leonard Price know that too?" Hazel looked away. "He knew a great many things." "And did he know," Miss Marple continued, "that when you were gone, the tea room would still be open, that customers might arrive early, that someone else would be here?" Hazel's hands clenched. "You're implying—" "I'm implying nothing," Miss Marple said gently. "Only observing." Hazel let out a breath. "You should leave." Miss Marple did so without protest. Outside, she nearly collided with Inspector Finch, who was approaching with Constable Davies. "Miss Marple," Finch said mildly, "I had a feeling I might find you here." "I was just leaving," she replied. "Miss Trent has been most patient." Finch glanced past her into the empty tea room. "We've confirmed something interesting," he said. "Leonard Price didn't come straight from the street. Someone let him in through the side door." "That suggests familiarity," Miss Marple said. "Or expectation." "Yes," Finch agreed. "We're narrowing things down." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Do be careful, Inspector. Narrow paths sometimes miss what's beside them." Finch regarded her thoughtfully, but said nothing more. That afternoon, news spread of another development. Leonard Price's briefcase had been found, not in the tea room, but at the bus stop near the edge of the village. Empty. Speculation flared anew. Theft. Blackmail. A secret meeting gone wrong. Miss Marple listened from her seat in the church hall as theories piled atop one another. She noticed who spoke eagerly and who remained silent. Silence, she reflected again, was rarely accidental. As she walked home at dusk, She passed Emily Foster, who was standing by the school gate frowning at the ground. "They're saying he was meeting someone secretly," Emily said. "That he'd arranged it days in advance." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked. "So the inspector thinks." Miss Marple nodded. "People who arrange secret meetings often rely on being predictable." Emily looked at her, puzzled, but Miss Marple was already walking on. By the time she reached her cottage, her mind felt satisfyingly ordered. There were still gaps, of course. There always were, but the shape of things was emerging. Leonard Price had planned something. Someone had anticipated him. And someone else, perhaps, had been meant to see nothing at all. Miss Marple set the kettle on and sat down by the window. "Expectation," she murmured, "is a very dangerous thing." And in Little Doveton, she was now quite certain someone's expectations had been fatally, deliberately met. Chapter 5. A Matter of Expectation. By the end of the week, Little Doveton had settled into a peculiar rhythm, one part daily life, one part ongoing inquest. People still went to work, tended gardens, attended choir practice, yet every action seemed accompanied by a sideways glance, as though the village itself were listening. Miss Marple noticed, as she always did, how quickly expectation became belief. The prevailing opinion now was that Leonard Price had come to Primrose Tea Rooms for a clandestine meeting, been struck down in a quarrel, and robbed. The empty briefcase at the bus stop suited this narrative perfectly. It also allowed the village to feel clever. Miss Marple, however, found the briefcase troubling in a different way. She raised the subject with Inspector Finch when she encountered him outside the post office. "Why the bus stop?" she asked. Finch adjusted his hat. "It's the most logical place to abandon it. Suggests flight." "Or intention," said Miss Marple. He studied her. "Go on." "If someone wished the briefcase to be found," she said, "they would place it somewhere obvious but impersonal. A bus stop is ideal. No single householder to notice. No private ground." Finch smiled thinly. "You think it was planted?" "I think it was positioned," Miss Marple replied. Later that day, she paid a visit to Mrs. Green, who was polishing her front windows with great enthusiasm. "I always thought Mr. Price was hiding something," Mrs. Green said eagerly. "Do you know, he once asked me about the old deeds of the tea room. Said he was interested in its history." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "When was that?" "Oh, months ago. He was very curious. Wanted to know who owned it before Hazel Trent." "And did you tell him?" "Only what everyone knows. It belonged to Miss Ada Fenwick before Hazel. Died rather suddenly, poor thing." "Suddenly?" Miss Marple asked. "Heart failure, they said, though she was younger than Hazel is now." Miss Marple thanked her and walked on, her thoughts accelerating. Miss Ada Fenwick. The name stirred a memory. She had been the original proprietor of Primrose Tea Rooms, retiring, or so it was believed, when ill health forced her hand. Ill health was a convenient explanation. That evening Miss Marple consulted old parish newsletters and council minutes, documents she kept meticulously filed. There it was, a brief notice from 8 years earlier announcing the transfer of ownership of Primrose Tea Rooms from Ada Fenwick to Hazel Trent. No mention of a sale price, no mention of family. "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. The next morning Inspector Finch called on her directly, a courtesy, but also a calculation. "We've uncovered something," he said, once seated. Leonard Price had been asking questions about Miss Ada Fenwick. He believed there was an irregularity in the transfer of the tea room. "Indeed," Miss Marple said calmly. "And did he tell anyone else this?" "Hazel Trent," Finch replied. "They had a heated exchange 2 weeks before his death." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "so that is what he was holding over her." "Blackmail," Finch said bluntly. "Possibly," Miss Marple agreed. "But blackmail is rarely a first resort." "It's usually a last," Finch leaned forward. "You're suggesting Miss Trent had motive?" "Motive, yes," said Miss Marple. "Opportunity, certainly, but not necessarily temperament." Finch frowned. "You don't think she did it?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that Miss Trent is a woman who endures pressure rather than explodes under it." Finch sat back. "We're also questioning others who knew about Fenwick." "Others?" Miss Marple echoed. "The vicar's wife, for one. She helped manage the tea room accounts years ago. Mrs. Cole. That too was interesting." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid Mrs. Cole another visit. The woman was, as always, eager to be helpful. "Yes, I assisted Ada Fenwick from time to time," Mrs. Cole said. "She wasn't well, you know. Hazel took over gradually." "Did Ada have family?" Miss Marple asked. A nephew, I believe, never visited. And the transfer, Miss Marple pressed. Mrs. Cole smiled nervously. All quite proper, I'm sure. Nervous smiles, Miss Marple reflected, were often more revealing than angry denials. As she left the vicarage, she noticed Colonel Bellingham watching from across the green. He joined her almost at once. "You've heard about the blackmail," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though blackmailers rarely die before they collect." The Colonel blinked. "What are you implying?" "That Leonard Price may not have been threatening Hazel Trent at all," Miss Marple said. "He may have been offering her something." The Colonel looked baffled. "Silence, perhaps," Miss Marple went on. "Or protection." She walked on, leaving him staring after her. By now, the shape of the case was no longer hazy. Someone had known Leonard Price would arrive early. Someone had expected Hazel Trent to be absent. Someone had understood the value of an unused room and an object heavy enough to end a life. But above all, someone had been very anxious that Leonard Price should not speak. To anyone. Miss Marple returned home and made herself a cup of tea, thinking of Miss Ada Fenwick, of transfers and omissions, of women who helped manage accounts. "Expectation," she murmured again, "is not just about timing, it's about trust." And somewhere in Little Doveton, trust had been very carefully and very deliberately betrayed. Chapter 6. Accounts, Omissions, and Old Kindnesses. The discovery of Miss Ada Fenwick's name had subtly altered the mood of the investigation. What had first appeared to be a crime of sudden violence now wore the more unsettling aspect of something planned long ago, nurtured quietly beneath layers of village routine. Miss Marple found this development entirely consistent with her experience. She began the day with a visit to the parish office, where old ledgers were kept in a tall, dust-smelling cupboard that no one had opened in years. Mrs. Cole, having heard of her interest, had offered access with an eagerness that was just slightly too pronounced. "It's all terribly dull," Mrs. Cole said apologetically, unlocking the cupboard. "Figures and notes and the like." "Dull things," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "are often the most instructive." The ledgers were neatly kept, their pages filled with careful handwriting. Miss Marple turned them slowly, noting patterns rather than particulars. She was not, strictly speaking, interested in sums. She was interested in habits. Miss Ada Fenwick's entries ended abruptly in the spring of her final year. After that, the hand changed. Still neat, but firmer, more decisive. "Hazel Trent," Miss Marple murmured. "Yes," Mrs. Cole said quickly. Ada trusted her completely. Hazel practically ran the place by then. "Trust," Miss Marple said, "is a very powerful thing." She lingered over one page where an entire month's entries had been summarized rather than itemized. "How curious," she said. "This was not Miss Fenwick's usual practice." Mrs. Cole leaned closer. She was unwell by then. "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Illness does make one simplify." But simplification, she reflected, also made concealment easier. That afternoon, Inspector Finch called again, his manner thoughtful. "We've confirmed that Ada Fenwick's nephew was never notified of her death," he said. "He lives in Canada now. He assumed she'd sold the tea room willingly." "Assumptions," said Miss Marple, "are the very soil in which mistakes flourish." Finch watched her closely. "You believe she didn't?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that Miss Fenwick trusted the wrong person at the wrong moment." "But Hazel Trent inherited the business legally," Finch said. "There's paperwork." "Paperwork," Miss Marple said mildly, "reflects what people agree to write down, not necessarily what they understand." Finch sighed. "Leonard Price suspected fraud." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but suspicion alone doesn't explain why he died when he did." That, she knew, was the heart of it. The next person she visited was Hazel Trent herself. This time Hazel allowed her in without protest. "I suppose you've come to accuse me properly now," Hazel said bitterly. "No," said Miss Marple. "I've come to ask you about Miss Fenwick." Hazel's expression closed. "Ada was kind to me." "She trusted you," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Hazel snapped. "And I looked after her." "Did you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Hazel turned away. She was ill, confused at times. "And frightened," Miss Marple prompted. Hazel was silent. Miss Marple let the silence stretch. She had learned that truth often surfaced when people rushed to fill quiet moments. "She didn't want to leave," Hazel said at last, "but she couldn't manage any more. I made sure the tea room stayed open. I did what had to be done." "And Leonard Price?" Miss Marple asked. Hazel's hands tightened. He said he'd found discrepancies. He said if I didn't sell to him, he'd go to the police. And you believed him? Yes, Miss Marple nodded. But he didn't come to threaten you that afternoon, did he? Hazel looked up sharply. What do you mean? I think, Miss Marple said, that Leonard Price came expecting someone else. Hazel stared at her. That's absurd. Is it? Miss Marple asked softly. You were not meant to be there. Everyone knew you fetched milk on Thursdays. Someone else knew Leonard Price would arrive early. Someone else had reason to fear what he knew. Hazel's face drained of colour. Who? Miss Marple did not answer. That evening the village buzzed again with fresh rumour. Inspector Finch had questioned Mrs. Cole at length. The vicar's wife, pillar of propriety, had emerged pale and indignant. She's terribly upset, Mrs. Green reported gleefully. Imagine being suspected at her age. Age, Miss Marple reflected, was often mistaken for innocence. She attended the prayer meeting that night, more out of habit than piety, and observed Mrs. Cole carefully. The woman spoke fervently of forgiveness, her voice steady, but her hands shook when she poured tea afterward. Miss Marple approached her quietly. You were very close to Miss Fenwick, she said. Mrs. Cole smiled tightly. We were friends. And you helped her with her accounts. Yes. Leonard Price knew that. Mrs. Cole's smile faltered. Did he? He spoke to several people, Miss Marple said, asking about old records, old transfers. Mrs. Cole's eyes flicked toward the door. He was an impertinent man. Indeed, said Miss Marple. And impertinent men often make others anxious. Mrs. Cole's voice dropped. I never meant any harm. Miss Marple regarded her steadily. Harm is not always the intention, she said. Sometimes it is merely the consequence. Later, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple laid out the pieces as one might arrange sewing notions. Hazel Trent, dutiful and pressed into decisions she barely understood. Ada Fenwick, trusting and fading. Leonard Price, probing where he sensed weakness. And Mrs. Cole, efficient, respectable, and very much aware of how things ought to look. One thing was now quite clear. Leonard Price had not died because of anger. He had died because he knew too much and was about to tell the wrong person. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. People, she murmured, do dreadful things to preserve their sense of order. And the most dangerous among them were those who believed sincerely that they were doing right. Chapter 7. The Weight of Respectability. By the time Sunday arrived, Little Doveton was no longer merely discussing the murder. It was defending itself against it. There was an unspoken agreement among the villagers that the crime must have been committed by someone who did not truly belong. Outsiders were safer culprits. They preserved the comforting fiction that the village's moral fabric remained intact. Unfortunately for that fiction, Inspector Finch's inquiries were moving steadily in the opposite direction. Miss Marple noticed the shift at church. The pews were full, yet the usual warmth of greeting was absent. People smiled a fraction too late, nodded a fraction too stiffly. Respectability had become something to be guarded rather than assumed. Mrs. Cole sat in her usual place near the front, her posture immaculate. She sang the hymns with conviction, her voice unwavering. Only once did she falter, when the vicar read a passage about hidden sins and the cost of silence. Her hand tightened on her prayer book, then relaxed again. Miss Marple watched quietly. After the service, conversation clustered politely around weather and upcoming fates, but names were avoided. Leonard Price's had become dangerous to speak aloud, like an accusation that might turn on the speaker. Inspector Finch stood outside the church speaking with Colonel Bellingham. As Miss Marple approached, the Colonel was saying loudly, I still say this whole thing is being made far too complicated. That's usually when it becomes interesting, Miss Marple remarked mildly. Finch smiled. I was hoping to speak with you, Miss Marple. Of course, she said. They walked together toward the green. We've established that Leonard Price arranged to meet someone at Primrose Tea Rooms that afternoon, Finch said. Not Hazel Trent, someone else. Did he say who? Miss Marple asked. No, Finch admitted, but he mentioned to his solicitor that he was close to resolving a delicate matter. Solicitors, said Miss Marple, are often told the truth in advance of everyone else. Finch stopped walking. You think he meant to confront Mrs. Cole? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that he intended to inform her. Inform her of what? That the transfer of the tea room was not as secure as she believed, Miss Marple said. that Miss Fenwick's declining health had been assisted, administratively speaking. Finch's expression darkened. That's a serious allegation. Yes, said Miss Marple, and Leonard Price knew how serious it was. They resumed walking. The difficulty, Finch said, is placing Mrs. Cole at the tea room at the right time. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People who live close by often forget how visible their movements are. That afternoon she took a long walk through the village, following no particular route. She paused to speak with Mrs. Turner, who lived opposite Primrose Tea Rooms. I was in my front room most of Thursday, Mrs. Turner said. Awful headache. Did you notice anyone going in or out of the tea room? Miss Marple asked. Well, Mrs. Turner hesitated. I did see Mrs. Cole crossing the lane earlier than usual. I thought it odd. She normally comes for tea later in the afternoon. How much earlier? Miss Marple asked. Oh, perhaps 4:45. Miss Marple thanked her and continued on, her pace unhurried. 4:45. That fit perfectly. The following morning brought another development. Leonard Price's mobile telephone was discovered in the storage room, slipped behind a crate. Inspector Finch shared this news with Miss Marple himself. No calls made that afternoon, he said, but several drafts of messages unsent. May I see them? Miss Marple asked. Finch hesitated, then handed her the list. They were brief. Blunt notes, unfinished thoughts rather than communications. You need to know. This will come out unless... I won't protect. Miss Marple handed the list back. He wasn't meeting someone to negotiate, she said. He was meeting someone to warn. Warn them that he would go to the authorities, Finch said. Or to the nephew, Miss Marple added. Either would have been ruinous. Finch exhaled slowly. That would explain panic. Panic, Miss Marple agreed, but not rage. They sat in silence for a moment. What made you suspect Mrs. Cole in the first place? Finch asked. Miss Marple folded her hands. Because she is the sort of woman who believes that order must be maintained at all costs. I once knew a woman in St. Mary Mead who altered a will because she believed the rightful heir would waste everything. She slept soundly for years, until someone threatened to undo her good work. Finch nodded grimly. That evening, Mrs. Cole called on Miss Marple herself. I know what people are saying, she said stiffly. I thought you, of all people, would understand. I do, Miss Marple replied. That is why I am worried. Mrs. Cole flushed. I never laid a hand on that man. I don't believe you did, Miss Marple said calmly. Mrs. Cole blinked. You don't? No, I believe you struck him with a teapot. The silence that followed was profound. He was going to destroy everything, Mrs. Cole whispered. Ada trusted us. Hazel needed protection. And Leonard Price. He was profiting from misery. So you decided, Miss Marple said gently. To protect the village. Mrs. Cole's shoulders sagged. I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted to stop him speaking. But you did stop him, Miss Marple said softly. Forever? Tears slipped down Mrs. Cole's face. I expected Hazel to be gone. I expected the room to be empty. He arrived early, so did I. Expectation, Miss Marple said, is what betrayed you. Mrs. Cole covered her face. Inspector Finch arrived shortly afterward, summoned quietly by Miss Marple. There were no raised voices, no dramatics, only a woman who had lived her life by appearances, now confronted with the consequences of preserving them too fiercely. As Finch led her away, Mrs. Cole looked back once. I only wanted things to stay decent, she said. Miss Marple nodded. Decency, she replied, is not the same as goodness. Later that night, Miss Marple sat by her window, the village once again wrapped in silence. The truth would soon be public, reshaped by gossip and softened by time. Little Doveton would endure. It always did. But somewhere deep within its tidy routines a fracture would remain, quiet, invisible, and permanently altered. And Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting at last, reflected as she often did. People are rarely undone by wickedness alone. Far more often, it is their virtues, misapplied, that lead them astray. Chapter 8. When the village nosed Little Doveton awoke the next morning to a knowledge it had not yet fully absorbed. Mrs. Winifred Cole had been arrested shortly after 9 o'clock, escorted quietly from the vicarage while her husband remained inside, unseen. There were no crowds, no dramatic scenes, only a subtle stillness, as though the village itself were holding its breath. By mid-morning the truth had travelled. It travelled as such things always did in stages. First disbelief, then correction, then elaboration. Miss Marple, returning from her walk, encountered Mrs. Green standing rigidly at her gate. "They've got it wrong," Mrs. Green said at once. "They must have. Mrs. Cole? Why, she's been organising the harvest supper for years." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "She was very capable." Mrs. Green's mouth tightened. "That doesn't mean—" "Capability," said Miss Marple, "often includes the ability to decide what must be done." Mrs. Green stared at her for a moment, then turned away without another word. At the post office, voices were hushed. At the grocer's, people avoided one another's eyes. Respectability, once assumed, now felt fragile, something that might crack if examined too closely. Inspector Finch came to see Miss Marple shortly before luncheon. He looked tired, but relieved. "She's made a full statement," he said. "Everything you said checks out. She altered the accounts during Fenwick's illness, ensured the transfer went through cleanly. Hazel Trent never knew the details." "And Leonard Price?" Miss Marple asked. "He discovered inconsistencies," Finch replied, "tracked down the nephew, intended to tell Mrs. Cole first, give her the chance to set things right, as he put it." Miss Marple nodded. "He underestimated her need for control," Finch sighed. "She said she believed he was threatening Hazel, that she acted to protect her." "She believed many things," Miss Marple said. "Belief is a powerful justification." Finch studied her. "You knew before the confession?" "I suspected," Miss Marple replied. "Certainty only comes when people speak." Finch smiled faintly. "You should have been a detective." "Oh no," Miss Marple said at once. "I only observe." That afternoon, Hazel Trent reopened Primrose Tea Rooms, quietly, without announcement. Miss Marple went in just after 4, as was her habit. Only 3 tables were occupied. The bell over the door sounded almost apologetic. Hazel brought her tea personally. "I didn't know," Hazel said abruptly, setting down the cup. "About Ada? About any of it?" "No," Miss Marple agreed. "You were meant not to know." Hazel sat opposite her, uninvited but unchallenged. "Mrs. Cole helped me. She guided me. I trusted her." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and she trusted herself." Hazel swallowed. "They say Leonard Price was a monster," Miss Marple stirred her tea. "He was an opportunist. That is not the same thing." Hazel was quiet for a moment. If he hadn't come, Miss Marple said gently, "something else would have happened." "Truth has a way of insisting," Hazel nodded slowly. "I don't know how to feel." "That is perfectly understandable," Miss Marple replied. "Feelings like villages take time to settle." As the days passed, Little Doveton did what it always did. It adjusted. There was sympathy for the vicar, who took leave for health reasons. There was awkwardness around Hazel Trent, now viewed with a mixture of pity and admiration. There was, most of all, a great deal of rewriting. Mrs. Cole became, depending on the speaker, either a tragic figure who had lost her way, or a woman who had always been rather controlling if one thought about it. Miss Marple heard both versions without comment. Inspector Finch concluded his work swiftly. There were no further surprises, no dramatic reversals. The case, once understood, was painfully straightforward. On his final evening in the village, he stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. "You were right about one thing," he said. "Expectation. She expected Hazel to be gone, expected Leonard Price to be manageable, expected herself to remain unseen." "Expectations," Miss Marple said, "are often mistaken for plans." Finch hesitated. "Do you ever wish you'd spoken sooner?" Miss Marple considered. "No. People reveal themselves when they are ready, or when circumstances force them to." Finch nodded. "I suppose they do." After he left, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the lights come on across Little Doveton. The village looked much as it always had. Peaceful, orderly, composed. Yet she knew, as she always did, that appearances were only a surface. At church the following Sunday there was a noticeable gap in the pews. The hymns sounded thinner. The vicar spoke of humility and forgiveness, his voice steady but subdued. Afterward, as Miss Marple walked home, Emily Foster caught up with her. "I'm thinking of staying," Emily said, "despite everything." "Or perhaps because of it," Miss Marple suggested. Emily smiled faintly. "You see people very clearly," Miss Marple returned the smile. "Only because people are so very consistent." That evening she resumed her knitting at last. The pattern, once interrupted, flowed easily again. Leonard Price would be buried elsewhere. Mrs. Cole would be remembered cautiously. Hazel Trent would go on pouring tea, her routine altered but intact. And little Doveton would continue, its hedges trimmed, its festivals planned, its secrets fewer but never entirely gone. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and reflected, as she often did, not on the crime itself, but on what had allowed it to happen. People, she murmured softly, do not murder because they are wicked. They murder because they believe they are right. Outside, the church bell rang the hour, and in the quiet that followed, little Doveton settled once more into the illusion of peace, wiser perhaps, but never quite as innocent as before. Chapter 9. Ripples of a Quiet Crime. Even as little Doveton settled into its new rhythm, Miss Marple knew the village would not soon forget the events of that week. It was remarkable, she reflected, how a single act, sudden and terrible, could alter the very texture of daily life. Teacups were still washed, the post still arrived on time, but conversations carried a weight that had not existed before. The vicarage garden was the first place where she sensed that subtle shift. She had called to inquire after Mrs. Cole's well-being, but found the garden empty save for a few lingering shadows of hedges and flower beds. The air was crisp with the early winter chill, and frost glittered along the edges of the grass. The quiet, Miss Marple observed, was not merely absence of sound, it was a presence in itself pressing against the consciousness of those who moved through it. Mrs. Cole's absence was explained soon enough. She had been moved to a quiet place under the watch of relatives until the courts could convene. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the village's attempt to maintain a sense of propriety, remove the cause of discomfort, leave the rest of the community unspoiled. But propriety, she thought, was often the skin over something much more fragile. That morning, Miss Marple visited Hazel Trent at Primrose Tea Rooms. The establishment had reopened, though with a certain cautious solemnity. Hazel poured tea with deliberate care, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the closed door at the back, the door to the storage room where Leonard Price had met his end. "I suppose people will whisper for a long time," Hazel said, arranging the cups, "even if they do not speak aloud." "They will," Miss Marple agreed, "but whispers too have their limits. People grow weary of uncertainty, and certainty, once found, offers a kind of peace, even when it is uncomfortable." Hazel nodded thoughtfully. "I keep thinking of what Mrs. Cole said, about protecting me, and the tea room, and Miss Fenwick's legacy. She acted as she thought best." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "She acted on expectation. That is the curious part of human behaviour. We trust that others will act in certain ways, and sometimes we're mistaken, sometimes fatally." Outside, a few villagers strolled along the lane exchanging brief greetings. The conversation inevitably returned to the events of the past week, though veiled in a mixture of sympathy, incredulity, and the odd desire to place blame elsewhere. Miss Marple observed them quietly, noting the subtle changes in posture, tone, and expression, the unspoken ways that fear and understanding mingled. Later she walked to the church, where the vicar's assistant was tidying up. The bell tower cast long shadows across the frost-hardened path. Miss Marple paused for a moment, considering the patterns of life and expectation. Leonard Price had come expecting one outcome. Mrs. Cole had responded according to her understanding of propriety and justice. Hazel Trent had continued her routine, unaware of the underlying currents. "People rarely act out of wickedness alone," Miss Marple murmured to herself. "They act out of conviction, convenience, fear, or misplaced kindness." She returned home by the edge of the village where the light was fading and the air carried the scent of wood smoke. Along the way she passed Emily Foster, who had emerged from the schoolhouse. The young woman greeted her with a faint, tentative smile. I understand more now," Emily said. "It's not as simple as I thought." "Very rarely is it," Miss Marple replied. "But understanding, even partial, is a kind of solace." Emily lingered a moment before moving on. Miss Marple watched her disappear down the lane and then continued to her own cottage. Inside she sat by her window, the evening light fading to a dusky violet. Her knitting lay beside her, unfinished, though her mind was busily arranging the subtle patterns of human behaviour she had observed. Every glance, every hesitation, every understated remark, these were the threads of the narrative that the village itself had not yet fully realised. Events ripple, she mused, like stones cast into still water. One small act, unseen by most, can disturb everything that seems settled. And often, she added with a fainter smile, the most ordinary among us are the most extraordinary in what they choose to do. Beyond the window, little Doveton slept under a thin layer of frost, its cottages dark and the streets almost empty. Yet in those quiet streets lives had shifted subtly, imperceptibly, but permanently. Secrets remained, though the most pressing one had been revealed. And Miss Marple, as always, watched with the calm patience of someone who understood that human nature never truly changed, only revealed itself in different forms over time, and in the stillness she knew, the village, though scarred, would endure. It always did. Chapter 10. Subtle Inconsistencies. By midweek, little Doveton had returned, outwardly at least, to its usual rhythm. The post still arrived. The grocer rang up bills, and the tea-room filled again with the clink of cups. Yet beneath this surface, Miss Marple noted small anomalies, tiny inconsistencies in behaviour that often spoke louder than words. It began at the vicarage, where Mrs. Cole's absence had shifted the balance of social interaction. People spoke more cautiously. Chairs remained in their places, unshifted. Even the children at the schoolyard whispered more carefully than before. Miss Marple observed these patterns quietly, aware that such minute changes often indicated the lingering ripples of fear and awareness. Her first stop was the post office, where Mr. Wilkes was unusually brisk. Letters were sorted faster than necessary, the ledger balanced perfectly. Yet when he thought no one watched, he tapped the counter nervously with his knuckles almost imperceptibly. "Troublesome business, Mr. Wilkes?" Miss Marple asked in a tone designed to seem casual. He started slightly. "Oh, no, Miss Marple. Just busy, that's all." Busy, she noted, yet the tapping suggested agitation, perhaps guilt, perhaps concern, or perhaps a reflection of the village's collective unease. Next, she wandered to the school, where Emily Foster was supervising her pupils. Emily's movements were precise, but there were moments where her eyes darted toward the closed back lane, toward Primrose tea rooms. Miss Marple observed that Emily, though young and new to the village, had already internalized its rhythms, who was likely to be present, who was likely to be absent, and what conversations were permissible. It was precisely this awareness, Miss Marple reflected, that often revealed more than direct confession. People left traces of themselves not in what they said, but in what they omitted, in what they overemphasized, in the patterns of their ordinary movements. Later, she visited Hazel Trent at the tea room. Hazel was back at the counter arranging plates for afternoon tea. "Everything seems to have settled," Hazel said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though sometimes settlement is merely appearance. Patterns remain." Hazel frowned slightly. "Patterns?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Subtle inconsistencies. I noticed Mr. Wilkes tapping his counter rather oddly today." Emily glanced down the back lane more than once. These are not confessions, but they are hints. Life always leaves a trail. Hazel nodded thoughtfully, pouring tea with deliberate care. That evening, as Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she reflected on the week's observations. There was Mrs. Cole's absence, Hazel's cautious composure, the village's nervous adjustments, and a few overlooked details. The timing of Leonard Price's visit, the presence of the unused storage room, and the movements of those who knew too much. "People," Miss Marple murmured to herself, settling into her chair, "do not always speak the truth, even when they intend to. Sometimes they leave it hidden in what they think is ordinary, what they believe no one notices." Outside, frost glinted under the lamplight. The streets were silent, but Miss Marple could sense the villagers' watchful eyes upon her, not from curiosity, but from the enduring knowledge that events, once set in motion, left impressions that were difficult to erase. And she knew, with the certainty that came from decades of quiet observation, that the solution lay not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in the patterns of ordinary life, the subtle inconsistencies that revealed intention, expectation, and human nature. As she knit by the fire, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The next step, she realized, would be to see how these inconsistencies connected, how the ripples from one small act had spread across the village and led, inexorably, to a single truth. Chapter 11. Testing Reactions. The following morning, little Doveton awoke to a brisk frost that sparkled on rooftops and hedgerows. Miss Marple, as was her custom, took her early walk, noting that the village's quiet unease lingered in the way people moved and spoke. It was the same subtle tension she had observed all week. Careful gestures, lowered voices, deliberate silences. Her first stop was Hazel Trent at Primrose Tea Rooms. Hazel greeted her politely, though a flicker of apprehension crossed her face when Miss Marple mentioned the storage room. "I've been thinking about the room," Miss Marple said casually, stirring her tea. "It seems such a simple place, yet it played a rather central part in recent events." Hazel's hands froze briefly. "I suppose," she said, setting down the teapot. Miss Marple observed carefully. The pause was slight but meaningful. Those who bore secrets often betrayed them in microseconds. "I also wondered," Miss Marple continued, "about who might have anticipated Leonard Price's visit. You were out fetching milk, I understand." "Yes," Hazel admitted, her voice steady, though her fingers tightened around the cup. "And someone else was present," Miss Marple prompted lightly. Hazel hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple inclined her head, allowing the silence to linger. Silence, she knew, often elicited more truth than questioning. Hazel's glance toward the back of the tea room was telling, fleeting though it was. Later, Miss Marple visited Emily Foster at the school. She engaged the young woman in casual conversation about routines, school schedules, deliveries, and how quickly people responded to the arrival of outsiders. "You noticed Leonard Price was expecting someone," Miss Marple said softly, as if speaking of nothing at all. "Did that person arrive, do you think?" Emily's lips pressed together. She hesitated, then said, "I don't know. He seemed confident someone would be there." "Confidence often implies preparation," Miss Marple observed. "Preparation implies someone else had been counting on it." Emily nodded slowly, clearly absorbing the suggestion without needing to commit. Miss Marple had planted a seed, allowing the young woman's own perceptions to surface. The key, Miss Marple reflected, was not to force confessions but to watch reactions. Who flinched at a casual remark? Who overcompensated an explanation? Who tried to appear unconcerned yet revealed anxiety in gesture or glance? By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage to see Mrs. Cole's husband, quietly arranging flowers in the garden. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I imagine it must be difficult. Knowing your wife has been drawn into events beyond her control." He nodded, his movements careful. "It is. She acted as she thought necessary." "Necessary," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes. And sometimes what seems necessary to one person seems dangerous to another." He looked at her keenly. "Do you understand her?" "I think I do," Miss Marple said, "more than she realizes herself." Through all of her visits that day, Miss Marple noted minor contradictions. A hesitated glance, a finger tracing an edge of a book, a step paused too long before continuing. Each was insignificant alone, but together they created a pattern. That evening she sat by her window knitting in silence. The village's calm seemed deeper now, almost contemplative. People were adjusting, accommodating the truth as it unfolded. Yet beneath that calm, the tension of expectation, the knowledge of what could have happened, remained. Miss Marple reflected on the subtle methods of human behaviour. Leonard Price had arrived with a plan. Someone else had anticipated it, and someone had responded in a way that forever altered the village's course. To understand people, she mused, one must observe not only what they do, but what they cannot help revealing in the smallest of gestures. In Little Doveton, as the dusk settled into soft darkness, Miss Marple had already begun piecing together the final pattern, how expectation, opportunity, and subtle control had combined to create the fatal moment. And she knew, as she always did, that the next day would bring her closer to understanding the precise manner in which the threads of human behaviour had been woven together. Chapter 12. The Subtle Game. The morning mist hung low over Little Doveton, softening the edges of cottages and hedgerows. Miss Marple walked slowly down Bell Lane, observing how the village had resumed its routines yet remained shadowed by the recent events. She was heading toward Primrose Tea Rooms, though not for tea or gossip but for observation. Today she intended to conduct a subtle experiment, a gentle, almost imperceptible test designed to watch how her suspect would react under ordinary circumstances. Hazel Trent greeted her as usual. The tea room was quiet, occupied only by a couple of early customers. Miss Marple took her usual seat by the window, letting her knitting rest in her lap while she allowed her eyes to wander across the room. Hazel's movements were precise, economical, and careful, but Miss Marple noticed that her posture stiffened slightly when a tray was set down near the counter, a subtle indication of heightened awareness. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple began softly, addressing Hazel as if in casual conversation, "about the storage room and how easy it is for small actions to have large consequences." Hazel's hands paused mid-motion. "I suppose so," she replied, her voice even, but her eyes flicked briefly toward the back door. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, folding her hands in her lap. "Sometimes people arrive where they are least expected, and reactions matter more than intentions." Hazel hesitated, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush rising to her cheeks. She did not press further, knowing that the hint of pressure was enough to provoke a revealing gesture. Later, Miss Marple invited Emily Foster to join her for tea. Their conversation wandered innocuously from school routines to village traditions, yet Miss Marple subtly guided the talk toward the movements of villagers on Thursday afternoon. She mentioned Leonard Price casually, without accusation, noting that some people had expected him, while others had been surprised by his presence. Emily's reactions were careful, measured, yet even she could not entirely mask a faint tightening of her hands and a slight hesitation in speech. Miss Marple made a mental note. Even minor reactions could illuminate motives and behaviours more than direct interrogation ever could. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple moved on to a more direct part of her experiment. She approached Mrs. Cole's house under the pretence of delivering a parcel of knitting yarn. The garden was quiet, the house still, and the air carried a faint chill that suggested the lingering awareness of events that could not be undone. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Cole," Miss Marple said pleasantly, offering a warm smile. "I thought you might like a little diversion. Some yarn for your knitting?" Mrs. Cole accepted it without comment, her eyes briefly meeting Miss Marple's. In that moment Miss Marple observed everything: the slight tightening around the corners of the mouth, the careful avoidance of her gaze, the faint tremor in her fingers as she took the package. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but it confirmed the presence of ongoing tension, a trace left by expectation, guilt, and fear. Miss Marple sat for a few minutes speaking of neutral matters: the frost on the hedges, the post office's new delivery schedule, the parish newsletter. She deliberately mentioned Leonard Price's name in passing, noting Mrs. Cole's immediate but slight flinch. It was exactly the response she had anticipated. Returning home at dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the day's subtle observations. The experiment had succeeded. Minor reactions, fleeting gestures, slight hesitations, all had revealed what words alone could not. People could mask intentions with conversation, but the truth persisted in small physical signals. The challenge now was to assemble these fragments into a coherent pattern, to trace how expectation, opportunity, and human weakness had combined to create a single fatal outcome. Sitting by the fire that evening, knitting needles idle in her hands, Miss Marple contemplated the delicate web of human behaviour she had begun to untangle. One final test, she realised, would suffice to expose the killer fully, not through accusation, but through carefully guided observation. "And when people are confronted with their own expectations," she murmured, "they often reveal more than they ever intended." Outside, Little Doveton lay quiet beneath the frost, its streets and cottages unchanged in outward appearance, yet subtly transformed by the undercurrent of secrets, fears, and human frailty. Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew that soon all would be revealed, and that the village would never be quite the same again.